The following stories delve into the darkest corners of the forest, places where sunlight fades and whispers echo between the trees. These tales may include disturbing themes, graphic content, and unsettling imagery. Listener discretion is strongly advised. If you're easily frightened or uneasy in the wilderness, you might want to turn back now. But if you dare to continue, remember, once you're lost in the deep woods, not everything wants you to find your way out. Welcome to Deep Woods Horror.
Story 1. I've always been a guy who needs to get outside to break away from the concrete and the noise and just let the woods remind me what quiet really feels like. I'm not really the type who does it for Instagram or tell people that I escape to nature on the weekends. I need it like I need sleep. That's probably why I was all ears when my buddy Tyler told me about a creek on the backside of a ridge around hours from where I live. According to him, no one went back there anymore. That old trail was basically erased when the service road was built a few years back, and people just forgot about it, which to me sounded like a gift from God. So Tyler is the kind of guy who's always brimming with half-baked plans and back pocket shortcuts, so I had him lay it all out for me. He promised if I followed his directions exactly, I'd end up at the kind of fishing hole people would daydream about: deep pools overhanging shaded banks, no tourists, no hikers, no boot prints in the mud. It would be me, the water, and that kind of quiet you only get in a place where the world's overlooked. So I spent Friday night packing up my gear: fishing rod, small tackle box, a couple of sandwiches of water and that I carry when I'm inside remote areas, and the rest of the standard odds and ends you would need. I'm not a prepper or anything, but I've done enough solo hikes to know you don't really mess around with this kind of stuff. You got to plan for a good time, but prepare for a bad one. Saturday morning came. The sky was a kind of clear blue that practically begs you to hit the road. The drive out there was pretty uneventful though, just me rolling through backcountry highways and old barns sliding past me, the occasional deer crossing sign of course, and just that gnawing excitement that comes before a new adventure. I hit that last turnoff that Tyler had mentioned to me, a gravel pull out near the edge of a tree, and sure enough there was this old slope leading down. No signs, no markers, just a faint depression of a trail that had been there long before that road. Had I parked and did a quick check on my gear and started down it. The sun was filtering through the pines, and long fingers that kind of dance on your skin and make you forget for a second that you're heading inside a place that doesn't really care if you come back from. There was also this certain thrill to it, sure, being out there where people don't go anymore, where cell phone signal dies and the only sounds you hear are the wind and the birds. But that's the point, isn't it? No one to bother me, no one to bother with me. Either the trail actually looked better than I expected it to. It was narrow, sure, but packed dirt and a few old switchbacks and a constant downhill grade that lets you know you're leaving the familiar behind you. I moved at a steady pace, heart light, sharp. Somewhere below that creek waited for me like a secret. I've been on the trail for maybe minutes. When I hit the first switchback, the descent was steady, but nothing too punishing. No need for trekking poles or careful footwork. Pines flanked on both sides, their needles softening the ground. The air nice and cool and clean. Birds chattered overhead, and while I let myself sink back into that rhythm, one bootfall after another, red tube gently knocking against my pack. Now around miles in, things changed. The trail curved left, hugging the side of the ridge. When I came to a fork that I hadn't been warned about, Tyler's directions were usually pretty thorough, obsessive even. He'd mentioned no fork, no deviation, just followed that trail all the way down. But here it was two narrow paths splitting at a patch of brush. One angled to the left toward a strand of sycamores, the other veered to the right, steeper, rougher, cutting deeper into the canyon. I stood there for a moment, chewing on the inside of my cheek, scanning the treetops as if the right answer might be hanging there in front of me. The left trail looked like it just wrapped around the ridge, maybe skirted the canyon, but the right hand dropped hard, where the water should inevitably be right. So I took the right, and at first, it didn't feel like the right call. The trail narrowed but stayed visible, flanked by a rock outcropping and a cluster of oaks, but half a mile in it began choking down shrubs, and young saplings pressed in on me, branches clawing at my sleeves. I had a duck under deadfall twice, and the ground was getting wetter, mud slick under my boots. I pushed on still though, figuring it had to open up, and this is where I noticed the silence around me. At first it was very subtle, just the fading of a bird song, the way my boots sounded sharp against the ground, but soon it was like the woods had swallowed their own voice. I paused, hands on my hips, catching my breath. Something about that stillness just made the hairs on my neck rise up. Turned back to look up at the trail, and there I saw a figure just barely peeking. From behind a tree, maybe yards up. It was a blink, a flicker of movement there and gone. Dark hair, pale skin, maybe a woman. I froze. My heart began to hammer. Logic now kicked in, telling me, okay, it's just another hiker, or maybe a local who knows the area better than you do. But that trail was a complete mess. Nobody in their right mind would come down this way unless they were as stubborn or dumb as I was. So I called out to them, "Hey, are you all right back there?" Of course I got nothing in response, no reply, no sound of any footsteps, so I waited, counting in my head, but the woods in front of me remained dead quiet. My skin began to crawl at the thoughts. I shifted my pack and gave those woods another hard look, and then turned back down trail. The trees began to thicken, crowding the path, until the trail just straight up vanished ahead. It was nothing but undergrowth and scattered boulders. Across this narrow ravine, I almost missed it, sat what looked like some kind of makeshift camp. A tarp hung low. Between two trees, a pile of firewood stacked under an oak, an old Coleman cooler tilted on its side. Someone was, or had been living out here. My stomach turned to the thought. Maybe I hadn't imagined that figure after all. Then, that's when I did hear footsteps. Soft, almost thoughtfully, moving through the brush to my left. I froze, ears straining, feeling my throat go dry. Suddenly I slid my phone from my pocket, not to call anybody. There wasn't any bars out here, but to use the screen like a mirror. I angled it over my shoulder, and there between the trees, maybe FT back, was indeed a woman, thin. Tangled hair, clothes dark and baggy. She wasn't walking toward me, at least not directly, but weaving through the trees. Keeping pace, eyes flicking between the ground and where I stood. I didn't want to wait anymore. I turned and started back uphill, keeping my pace steady, pretending not to notice her. I didn't sprint. Not yet. Just move fast enough to show that I was leaving the area. My hands were itching for that on my head, but drawing it now felt like this kind of escalation that I wasn't quite ready for. The trail then narrowed, pinched by this fallen tree, and I jumped it, gasping and tasting copper on my tongue. My mind spat half-formed plans out. Loser at the fork, call out if I saw anybody, fire a warning shot if I had to. The sounds behind me grew sharper, more desperate, sticks snapping, breathless hitches, the slap of soles against dirt. Enough. I yanked that from the holster and fired 2 shots into the air. The echo cracked through the trees like a whip, and for a heartbeat the woods froze as well, and then through the hush, the unmistakable sound of retreat footsteps pounding back the way they come. I spun around and caught a quick glimpse of her, the woman, hair flying, arms pumping, bolting back down the trail like something feral, something that had been burned by the sound of that gun. I holstered the pistol, wiped sweat from my brow, and kept climbing. No stopping now. No stopping until I saw my truck. The climb out of that canyon felt twice as long on the way back. My legs were burning, lungs straining, every muscle wired tightly, waiting for the slap of feet to return behind me. But the woods had gone still again, almost too still, like they were watching. Holding their own breath, I kept my head down and pushed up the trail, counting every bend and switchback. Feeling sweat beat down my spine, I told myself over and over, do not look back. Do not give her that satisfaction. Do not show her that you're scared. But every now and again I couldn't help it. I'd glance over my shoulder, eyes darting through the trees. Nothing. Just shadows, just the wind teasing the undergrowth. When I hit that fork again, I barely slowed. I could see now how I've been led wrong. The overgrowth path that I had taken was just subtle enough to pull somebody in without really thinking. Tyler's directions had been clear. No forks, no turns, which meant the path shouldn't have existed, and my gut twisted at that thought. The last mile was a complete blur. The sky was starting to dim, and the sun was dipping behind the ridge. The woods were slipping into that blue-grey half-light that makes everything look wrong. Every sound around me was amplified, the snap of twigs, the hush of the wind, my own ragged breathing. I kept my hand near that gun, listening for anything and everything. By the time I saw the edge of the trees and the shape of my truck parked in that gravel turnout, it almost felt like a hallucination. I half stumbled up that last stretch, boots slipping and heart hammering like it wanted out of my chest. I threw my gear In the back seat, without any kind of ceremony, climbed into the cab and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, hands on, the wheel forehead resting against the rim, letting the tremors roll throughout me. My mouth was dry, tongue sticking to the roof, and when I finally started the engine, the sound nearly made me flinch. That drive home was dead quiet for hours. No music, no podcast, just the hum of the tires and the relentless replay of what I'd seen, the woman's pale face between trees, the ragged clothes. The way she sprinted when those shots rang out when I got home, I didn't even unpack. I walked inside, sat on the couch and rang Tyler. He picked up on the second ring, voice easy and relaxed. "Yeah, how was it? Catch anything good?" I swallowed. My throat was raw. "Hey, quick question. Are you really sure about that trail you said no forks, right?" "Yeah, man, dead straight. It's been a couple of years since I was down there, though, but it's a simple run." He paused. "Why you get turned around or something?" There was a fork, though, about and took me off the main trail and down toward a ravine. I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Tyler, are you sure you're remembering right?" There was a pause on the line, just enough to raise every hair on my arm. Then his voice came back a little quieter. "Dude, no, there's no fork. There's never been one." I closed my eyes and my skin felt cold all over, like the sweat I'd worked up on. The climb had now frozen in place. I told him I'd fill him in later, hung up, and just sat there in the dark, listening to my house settle every creak and pop, sounding a little too sharp for my own comfort. My mind would not let it go. The fork, the woman, the camp tucked away like an old scar in the landscape. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and I'm sure you can guess I never went back to that canyon, not once, not even to check if the fork was actually still there. Tyler tried to talk me into another trip months later, but I turned him down straight up. Whatever's down there, or whoever's down there, can keep it. Story 2. I needed to get away badly. The city had been chewing me up bit by bit, day after relentless day, emails, deadlines, traffic that never moved, all of it blended into a toxic cocktail I could feel eroding me from the inside out. A couple of nights in the woods, away from everything and everyone, seemed like exactly the kind of detox I needed. I picked a place near Navajo country, tucked away deep in northern Arizona. The trailhead was barely a trailhead at all, just a rusted sign half hidden in weeds marking a path so faint it could have been mistaken for a deer track that suited me perfectly if it wasn't popular. I'd have real solitude, genuine peace. I parked my old Subaru off to the side and grabbed my backpack from the back seat. It was quiet, just the faint whispering of pines in the gentle morning breeze, and for the first time in months my shoulders felt lighter. I checked my phone out of habit. 0 bars. No surprise there, but even my GPS app flickered erratically, glitching between coordinates. I shook my head, switched off the device completely and slid it into a pocket. I wouldn't be needing it anyway. The hike started easy enough. The trees, tall ponderosa pines and dense green junipers, created a welcome shade against the early sun. The air was crisp, sharp, with the scent of resin and earth. For the first half hour, my tension unwound steadily with each step, my mind clearing of the urban clutter I'd carried with me. But as I walked deeper, something subtle shifted in the air. The sounds, the birds, insects, even the wind dropped away like someone had dialed down the volume. Silence took over, so dense it felt oppressive, pressing against my ears until my own breathing seemed loud and alien. I forced myself onward, convinced it was just my imagination running wild. After all, the solitude was exactly why I'd come, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, the sensation crawling up the back of my neck, prickling the skin under my collar. At first I thought maybe it was an animal, something curious yet cautious, watching from a safe distance, but animals didn't produce a silence like this, a total absence of life. The further I went, the stranger things became. Twigs were scattered oddly along the sides of the trail, arranged in crude triangles, purposeful shapes that set my teeth on edge. Further along, the bark of a few large trees was shredded, scored deep with long parallel gouges. They looked too deliberate, too high off the ground for any animal I knew. I brushed my fingers across the wounds in the wood and felt a shiver ripple down my spine. I reached what should have been my campsite by mid-afternoon, according to the map I'd printed, but when I got there, the clearing wasn't a clearing at all. It was dense, wild brush, a twisted tangle of roots and branches that seemed intent on denying me entry. I checked my Map again confused the coordinates lined up perfectly, yet nothing matched what I was seeing. I sighed and decided to backtrack slightly, figuring I'd made a simple mistake, but when I turned around, the path behind me had shifted somehow. The pines I just passed through had closed in tighter, forming a different route than I remembered. My pulse quickened. I could have sworn I'd come straight through those two large trees. But now there were three clustered too close to have allowed my passage. "You're just tired," I whispered, the words barely audible in the thick silence. "You're seeing things." I made camp. Anyway, clearing space among the roots and fallen pine needles, darkness crept in quickly, far faster than I'd anticipated. The forest grew even quieter, the oppressive stillness deepening until it felt like a tangible presence around me. I built a small fire, the flames crackling reassuringly, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. Eventually, fatigue won out over paranoia. I crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside. Sleep came uneasily in fits and starts, fractured by dreams filled with long-limbed shadows creeping along my tent walls. Then sometime after midnight, I woke abruptly, my eyes shot open, ears straining into the darkness. Footsteps circled outside my tent, slow, deliberate, barefoot on dry pine needles. My heart hammered painfully, adrenaline sharpening my senses to an unbearable edge. I lay motionless, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside the thin nylon barrier. A low sound reached me, breathing slow and deliberate. A soft exhale brushed the fabric of my tent as if something on the other side was sniffing, taking in my scent. Fear coiled in my stomach, heavy and sharp, gathering. Every ounce of courage, I unzipped the tent flap, just enough to peer into the darkness, shining my flashlight. In a sudden burst of defiance, the beam swept over empty space. The breathing ceased. Instantly, heart pounding, I leaned forward slightly, angling the flashlight down toward the ground. Fresh footprints stood stark against the dry soil, elongated toes, narrow arches, not quite human but not entirely animal either. I jerked the flashlight beam around the clearing, sweeping it between tree trunks, but saw nothing but shadows dancing mockingly on the bark. I retreated back inside, hands shaking violently as I zipped the tent shut. Sleep never returned. I huddled there until dawn. Broke, faint and cold, promising safety. It couldn't possibly deliver when morning came. The silence remained thick and stifling as ever. Whatever had been outside my tent hadn't truly left it. Lingered in the trees, watching, waiting, and I knew with grim certainty the forest wasn't going to let me leave, not without a fight. The morning sun was a sickly, muted glow behind the trees, offering little warmth and even less comfort. I staggered out of my tent, joints stiff from hours spent tense and unmoving, every muscle coiled tight from the previous night's terror. My campsite was exactly as I'd left it, but the footprints, the long twisted impressions of bare feet, circled relentlessly, a chilling reminder of the unseen presence that stalked the shadows. I packed up my gear hastily, eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods. Logic screamed at me that whatever it was had to have moved on, had to have lost interest, but instinct whispered darker truths. It was still here, waiting, watching, with no clear path and nowhere else to go. I started moving downhill, hoping the small creek I'd seen yesterday would lead me to safety, maybe a road or an open clearing, anything other than this claustrophobic maze of trees. But the landscape mocked my optimism, looping cruelly. The creek twisted and bent in impossible patterns, doubling back on itself until I found myself standing, breathless, exactly where I'd started hours ago. I stopped and stood still, fighting a rising wave of panic. The silence was deafening. No wind, no rustle of leaves, no chirping birds. My breath echoed harshly, painfully loud in my own ears. Every instinct screamed that this silence was unnatural, predatory. It was. Then I heard it, a low, clicking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing faintly. From somewhere behind me, my pulse spiked, adrenaline racing. I turned slowly, eyes straining into the gloom. The forest seemed empty, motionless, yet the clicking persisted, dry and brittle, like bones being tapped together. "Hello?" My voice cracked, hollow and uncertain, disappearing into the oppressive silence. In response, the clicking abruptly stopped. Seconds dragged on painfully. Just as I turned back, a faint whisper broke through the stillness, carrying softly through the trees. "Hello?" My heart lurched violently. The voice, it sounded Exactly like mine, the inflection, the slight uncertainty, the pitch perfectly. Mimicked, I spun around, frantic eyes darting between trees, but saw nothing but endless trunks and shadows. What the hell? I whispered, backing up slowly. This wasn't possible. Was I losing my mind already? Another whisper drifted closer, echoing my panic again in my own voice. What the hell? I bolted. Panic surged through my limbs, driving me blindly through the underbrush. Branches tore at my skin. Sharp rocks hidden beneath moss threatened to twist my ankles, but I ran until my lungs burned and vision blurred. Finally, stumbling over a fallen log, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The forest around me seemed to close tighter, the trees looming above me like silent judges. Blood trickled down my face from a cut above my eye. I blinked away, sweat and blood scanning the shadows. My heart nearly stopped when I caught sight of it for the first time. It stood motionless among the trees, tall, emaciated and horribly twisted. Its body was humanoid, yet wrong, elongated limbs, covered in uneven patches of coarse fur and sickly pale skin. Its face was even worse, a distorted, pale imitation of human features stretched awkwardly as though wearing someone else's skin. Its eyes shone faintly, reflecting the dim sunlight like those of an animal, yet it stood erect, completely still. I froze, my throat too tight to scream. The thing tilted its head slowly to one side, studying me. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth too sharp, too numerous, packed into a jaw not meant to hold them. Slowly, deliberately, it took one step toward me. I stumbled backward, scrambling away, eyes locked on its unnatural gait. It moved in jerks and twitches, almost as though it was mimicking human movement from memory, poorly and grotesquely. I broke eye contact for just a second, and when I looked up again, the thing was closer, far closer than it should have been. Its limbs bent at strange angles, its body twisted grotesquely around a tree, peering at me from behind the trunk. Still silently observing. "Stay back," I shouted, voice trembling. It simply stared, its eyes empty of comprehension or mercy. Desperation pushed me to my feet, grabbed a stone from the ground and hurled it toward the creature. It struck the trunk next to it with a loud crack, sending splinters flying, but the thing didn't flinch. It merely shifted, vanishing momentarily behind the tree trunk, emerging again closer, far too close now. I turned and sprinted again. This time, in sheer animal panic, my feet pounded the forest floor in a chaotic rhythm, my chest aching from exertion and terror behind me. The forest erupted into a cacophony of horrific sounds, voices overlapping, distorted screams, animal cries merging into a terrifying chorus. Each voice was unmistakably mine, yet twisted, tortured, mocking. The creature wasn't chasing me. Not exactly, it was toying with its prey. Eventually I collapsed against a broad tree trunk, gasping, dizzy with fear and exhaustion. The voices had stopped, leaving only the oppressive silence again. I was utterly, completely alone, trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. Hours passed. Darkness began to close in again. Gathered the remains of my shattered courage and built a small, trembling fire, desperate for any source of comfort. Sat huddled by the flickering flames, knife clenched tightly, afraid to even blink. When the voices began again, they came softly, almost soothingly. This time, familiar voices from my past, my mother's. Gentle tone called to me from just beyond the firelight, inviting me closer, urging me to step into the darkness. Own voice echoed hers, calm, reassuring, telling me that the danger had passed. My mind wavered momentarily, drawn toward the comforting illusion. But beneath the soft words, I heard the dry clicking. Returned sharper this time, closer. The illusion shattered. I gripped the knife, harder, knuckles white. It was out there, watching me, whispering lies and voices stolen from my memories, waiting patiently for me to falter, to trust, to let my guard down even for a moment. Shivering violently, despite the fire, I realized I was already losing my sanity. I needed to escape soon, or I'd never leave these woods alive. And as the clicking drew closer, I understood with cold clarity. I was being hunted, and dawn might not come fast enough. At dawn, the forest was drenched in a ghostly fog, blurring the trees into dark, looming shapes. I hadn't slept, hadn't dared close my eyes, but the faint grey light was enough of a signal that it was time to move. My hands trembled as I hurriedly packed my gear, leaving behind everything non-essential, desperate to shed weight. The thing was out there, close, patient, waiting for the smallest slip-up. I stood at the edge of my dying fire, breathing. Shallow and quick silence surrounded me. But it wasn't the comforting silence of solitude. It was oppressive, suffocating, waiting for something. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, and this time, I didn't resist. I picked a direction at random and bolted through the trees. My lungs burned immediately, legs aching with fatigue, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The underbrush tore viciously at my skin thorns, leaving thin crimson trails along my arms and face, but I couldn't slow down. Not now. Behind me, the silence, fractured voices erupted, layered screams interwoven with guttural animalistic growls. My own voice was loudest, echoing mockingly through the trees. "Wait, come back, don't leave me." Risked a glance over my shoulder, my blood freezing at the sight. It was there, flashing between trees, moving in an impossible blur, its elongated limbs twisted grotesquely as it sprinted, each step unnatural yet terrifyingly swift. Its eyes glowed in the dim morning light, fixed unwaveringly on me. Terror gave way to blind panic, my feet barely touching the ground as I hurtled downhill, nearly tumbling headlong into a shallow creek bed. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering, and froze at the sight in front of me. A deer carcass sprawled grotesquely across smooth stones. Its antlers had been brutally snapped, eyes hollowed out, mouth locked open in a permanent silent scream. Blood still seeped slowly into the creek, staining the clear water deep red before I could process the horror. I felt a presence behind me, impossibly close. I whipped around, breath catching in my throat. The thing stood mere yards away, motionless, head tilted at a nauseating angle as though curious. It opened its mouth slowly, exposing rows of jagged teeth, lips pulling back into a grotesque mockery of a smile. "Please." My voice was barely audible. Pathetic whisper. The creature took a slow step forward, its body shifting and twisting, bones cracking audibly beneath skin stretched thin and pallid. Instinct seized control, and I lunged blindly toward a fist-sized rock at my feet. Hurled it toward the creature with all the strength I had left. It missed, narrowly smashing against a nearby tree and sending a shower of splinters through the air. The creature didn't flinch, its head merely tilted in. Amusement. I ran again, forcing my battered body forward. Branches whipped past me, vision blurring with tears and sweat behind me. I could hear it now, clearly pursuing, moving with fluid predatory ease, whispering words stolen from my mind ahead. Through the haze of desperation, I saw something. A gap in the trees, open sky beyond hope, surged with a final burst of strength. I stumbled forward, bursting suddenly into an area of burnt ground, a wide blackened scar left by some past wildfire. Ash and charcoal crunched beneath my boots as I staggered into the open, collapsing to my knees, lungs screaming for air. I twisted around frantically, expecting to see the creature bearing down on me, but it had stopped abruptly at the edge of the burnt ground, pacing restlessly, its body tense. It growled softly, frustrated, refusing to cross the threshold into the charred earth. Relief came sharp and painful, mingling with raw exhaustion. Whatever this place was, whatever its significance, it was safe at least. Momentarily, I forced myself up, following the burnt scar, eyes locked on the thing, watching me silently from the shadows. I followed the scorched earth until it merged with an old, forgotten road, overgrown, barely recognizable, but unmistakably human-made. My heart leaped. Civilization's safety might actually exist beyond this nightmare. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed myself forward, forcing one foot in front of the other. Hours later, exhausted and half delirious, I stumbled onto a decrepit hunting cabin, rotting wooden walls half hidden by thick vegetation. The door swung inward easily, hinges rusted and crumbling. Staggered inside, collapsing onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably, and waited for whatever came next through a crack in the door. I glimpsed movement in the distance. It was there, standing silently at the tree line, staring, its form blurred and wavering in the shadows. Eventually, it faded back into the forest, leaving me alone. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight streamed through gaps in the cabin walls, warm and reassuring voices echoed outside, real human voices calling my name. My rescue had arrived. They'd been searching for days, alerted by my abandoned car and the frantic voicemail I'd managed to leave days earlier. They found me bloody dehydrated, barely coherent days later, from the sterile comfort of a hospital bed. I tried to explain everything I'd seen. They nodded, politely spoke quietly among themselves, and attributed my ramblings to trauma and exposure. But an old Navajo nurse, tending to my wounds, looked me dead in the eye and quietly said, "You wandered where people aren't meant to go. You're Lucky it let you out at all. After recovering, I returned briefly to the trailhead, compelled by some desperate need to understand, but there was no trail, only impenetrable trees and thick brush, as though the forest itself had closed like a wound behind me. A local elder stopped me before I went any further, shaking his head gravely. You survived once, don't test fate. Twice I listened. I had no intention of ever stepping into those woods again, but even now, months later, in my quiet apartment back in the city, I still hear its sometimes soft footsteps circling. Outside my window late at night, quiet whispers in a voice far too much like mine. And I know now that the forest never truly let me go. It's just waiting patiently for me to slip back into its reach. Story 3. The Tooth Forest. I talked my best friend Ethan into a spring deer spotting trip deep in central Idaho. He was hesitant at first. Ethan always preferred well-worn trails and cell reception, but something in my voice must have tipped him off that I needed this, needed the quiet, needed the wilderness, and maybe, just maybe, needed to know something else waited out there. We drove north from Boise all day, the truck humming steadily down winding mountain highways. Snow still rimmed the shoulders in dirty crusts, and bare tree limbs clawed at the grey sky like fingers. By dusk, we rolled into the tiny town of McCall, Idaho, a frozen little postcard propped against a glacial lake. There was one open gas station, a rusty coffee stand, and a short gravel runway at the edge of the lake, where a few float planes hunkered like sleeping gulls. We bunked in the truck that night under a starless sky, eating beef jerky and sharing a flask to keep the cold at bay. At first light, a grizzled bush pilot named Tom met us beside his battered de Havilland Beaver. He wore a tattered bomber jacket and spoke in half sentences. The man said nothing about our gear, just helped load our packs, rifles, and a week's worth of jerky and oats into the cargo hold. Then he gunned the throttle. The plane clawed its way into the morning air, skimming the treetops before rising over a sea of endless ridges and firs. From that high up, the forest looked like old green fur, rippling in the wind. Then the mountains opened into a narrow gorge, Big Creek. We touched down on a thin dirt airstrip tucked between canyon walls. No buildings, no people, just a windsock and the steady hush of pine trees. Tom gave us a half wave and was airborne again before I could say thank you. In seconds, the engine faded, and we were alone with a silence so complete it rang in my ears. We started north, following a thin footpath beside Monumental Creek. Snow patches still clung to the shady banks, and ice crackled under our boots. The water, swollen with melt, hissed like a living thing. Around midday, we left the trail and hiked into an unnamed draw. Lodgepole pines grew tight as prison bars, forcing us to turn sideways to squeeze through. That was when I noticed the first mark. A sapling, no thicker than my wrist, stood inches from my face. Midway up its trunk, a perfect V-shaped notch had been carved into the bark, as though something large had sunk a single tooth into it. At first I thought it was an axe scar, maybe trailblazes, but it was too precise, too organic, a clean puncture, no tear. I looked around. Dozens of saplings, maybe hundreds, bore the same wound, always at knee height, always a single bite. Ethan froze beside me. Wolves? He offered, but even he didn't believe it. We kept going, pushing into a small meadow on higher ground and setting up camp beside a ring of frost-bleached stones. As the sun dipped behind Dead Mule Ridge, a cold fog crept in, low and thick. We roasted jerky over a tiny stove, trying to laugh off the weird forest, but neither of us found it funny. That night I woke to a sound. Not wind, not a coyote. It was low, steady, and musical, a humming, like someone singing without words. The tone wavered, rising and falling, echoing through the trees. I held my breath. Then in the dark, Ethan whispered, "Did it say my name?" I didn't answer, because I thought I'd heard it too. The humming continued for what felt like hours. When it stopped, the silence slammed down so hard it made my ears ring. Then, snap! A single twig broke just outside the tent. I didn't move. Ethan didn't breathe. We waited. Nothing. Somehow, we drifted into sleep again. At dawn, sunlight painted the tent walls in a soft orange glow. Ethan unzipped the flap, froze, and whispered, "Dude, look." Wah. Our gear had been moved. Both rifles, the ammo belts, our food bags, everything were now arranged in a perfect ring around the tent, each item precisely spaced, like fence posts. The ground inside had been swept clean. No prints, no drag marks, just dirt, smooth as a polished floor. At the ring's outer edge lay a row of freshly snapped sticks, each one smooth, green, and marked with the same single bite notch as the saplings. They were all angled in the same direction, pointing due east, up the ridge. Ethan's face went pale. "This is a message," he whispered. Something inside me shifted. I wanted to leave. Every cell in my body screamed to pack up and run for the airstrip, but a different instinct twisted harder: rage, fear, and a raw need to understand what thought it could toy with us. "We follow the trail," I said. "We find out who did this." Ethan didn't argue. We left most of our gear and followed the line of bitten sticks up the slope. Fog swallowed the meadow behind us. Every few hundred yards, another branch waited, always fresh, always bleeding sap, always pointing uphill. The air turned sour, like rotting meat under a wet tarp. Clouds rolled in, sleet pattered on our hoods, stinging our faces. The trees turned to grey shadows. I kept my rifle ready, though my hands shook from the cold, or something worse. At the 5th marker, Ethan stopped. "Hear that?" I held my breath. A sound drifted up from below, deep, slow, and wet. A laboured inhale, then a rattling exhale, like something breathing through a cracked rib cage. It was beneath us. We crept forward until Ethan's boot punched through the ground with a sharp crack. He yelped and staggered back. A sinkhole had opened below, hidden by moss and pine needles. We edged to the rim and shone our lights down. A cavern yawned beneath us, big as a house. Its floor was carpeted in bones, jawbones mostly, piled in heaps, some small as rabbits, some too large to name. Elk, deer, bears, even a few massive double-hinged skulls that didn't belong in any guidebook I'd ever read. Every skull had a canine tooth missing. From the pit's dark center came the sound of breathing, wet, guttural, close. Then something moved. A massive grey shape shifted against the rock. My light hit slick skin, pulsing veins, something huge, something alive. Then my flashlight flickered and went dead. I grabbed Ethan. "Run!" We turned just as the cavern exploded behind us. Bones tumbled, earth split. Something massive surged upward from the pit. Unseen but terrifyingly real. Trees cracked, the ground shook. We ran. Branches clawed at us. Thunderous crashes chased us like an invisible freight train. A fallen log blocked the narrow saddle ahead. Ethan slipped on the wet bark and went down. I yanked him up. My pack ripped open, gear spilling into the underbrush. We left it and kept running. The ridge ended in a steep rock chute. We scrambled down, boots kicking sparks on the stone. Then, suddenly, we burst out onto the icy banks of Monumental Creek. The crashing stopped. We plunged into the water. It was freezing, biting, but we pushed through, gasping, stumbling. Whatever had followed us stopped at the trees. It would not cross the creek. 3 miles downstream we saw it, the thin strip of dirt that marked Big Creek Airstrip. A Forest Service pilot was warming up his Cessna. He saw us, rushed over, bundled us in blankets, shoved heat packs into our gloves. At the clinic in Riggins that night, a deputy took our report. "Plenty of wolves up there," he said with a shrug, like that explained anything. Later I checked my smashed GoPro. Only one frame survived. It showed Ethan and me sleeping in our tent just before dawn. Outside the ring of gear, in the mist, stood a tall, narrow shadow. 5 impossibly long fingers gripped a fresh green stick. The sap still bled. The shadow was bending down, as if about to plant it behind our heads. Ethan keeps asking if we should go back, to get proof. I tell him no. Some secrets the mountains are welcome to keep. And every time I hear a low, wordless hum in the wind, I remember that breath in the dark. And I know I will never climb Dead Mule Ridge again. Story 4. The Unseen Watcher. I used to love the way the Colorado timber smelled at night, the sharp, fresh scent of pine, the coolness of stone, and a lingering hint of wood smoke that clung to the air even after the fire died. But that first night near Trapper's Lake, everything felt different. The familiar sense that once grounded me felt layered with something unnatural, sour and electric, like the forest itself was uneasy, as if it knew something I didn't. Dad had chosen the campsite for its remoteness. It was the kind of place he loved, quiet, secluded, a haven from the noise of the world. We were miles from the nearest trailhead, tucked against a ragged tree line just below the timberline, far from the hum of highways or the glow of RV parks. Only the lake's deep, slow breathing in the dark. and the dance of a million stars above filled the space. The evening unfolded in a familiar rhythm. We strung up tarps, hung the food from a high branch, and swapped stories, the same old jokes, the same banter, yet somehow each retelling still felt fresh. As the fire dimmed and the last ember winked out, Lisa yawned and Sean mumbled a bourbon-soaked anecdote. Dad, always the shepherd of our little family herd, was already nudging them toward their tents. I wasn't tired, not yet. I claimed it was the altitude, but the truth was simpler. Silence like that was addictive, the kind of silence you could wrap yourself in, something so deep it pressed against your skin. I stayed behind, sitting alone beside the fire ring, watching the glowing coals slowly fade to ash and listening to the wind that rustled through the spruce trees. The night was settling in when I finally crawled into my little dome tent, barely a dozen strides from the camp. The nylon walls creaked as I zipped myself in, rolled onto my back, and stared at the dark ceiling. At first, there was only the wind, a steady, polite rustling of branches, calm and predictable. But then came something else, a sound, new and out of place, braided through the breeze. It was wet, heavy, a deliberate inhale, drawn low to the ground, traveling along the back wall of my tent. It paused, then continued. Whatever was outside seemed to be memorizing my scent, taking its time. My mind raced, trying to explain it away. A bear, maybe a black bear sniffing for food, but my muscles locked up with tension, my knees aching against the foam of the sleeping pad. I lay still, my breath shallow, waiting. The sniffing faded, but the forest didn't relax. I heard the first crunch by the cold fire pit, followed by a slow, deliberate scrape, wood on gravel. It was measured, unhurried. The drag circled wide around Dad's tent, then Lisa and Sean's, and finally mine, tracing a ring through the pine needles and dust. My mind spun through possible explanations, an elk rubbing its antlers, maybe wind tipping a loose branch, but each theory collapsed as the footsteps resumed, bipedal and uneven, stopping just inches from my door. Then, in an instant, the night burst white, like a camera flash, close enough that my shadow jumped against the inner walls of the tent, crisp and black. I squeezed my eyes shut, disoriented, waiting for retreating footsteps, for any sign that whatever was out there would leave, but nothing moved. The air felt vacuum still, my heart thudded loudly in my ears. And then the tent fabric beside my hips deformed, pushed inward by a slow, deliberate weight. Not a pore, too broad, too precise. Someone, or something, was there, just outside the tent. It settled down, exhaling a shallow breath that warmed the nylon between us. Seconds ticked by, feeling like minutes. I lay paralyzed, counting each heartbeat, every pulse louder than the wind. Fingers, light, almost curious, began to toy with the tent's lower seam, tugging at the corners, testing the material. I could hear the plastic teeth of the zipper clink as the pull lifted a single notch. My lungs rebelled. I couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Hey, who's out there?" I called, my voice cracked and loud, shattering the silence like a rifle shot. For a heartbeat, everything stayed frozen. Then Dad's voice came, slicing through the darkness. "Caleb, you okay?" A zipper rasped. Boot soles crunched across the clearing. A flashlight beam lanced through the trees. The pressure on the tent fabric vanished. No rustling, no scrambling, just gone. I fumbled for my own zipper, tumbling out of the tent into the harsh light of Dad's flashlight. My eyes adjusted, and I almost collided with his outstretched arm. Behind him, Lisa and Sean blinked in their tent doorway, half awake. Their border collie, Daisy, watched us with bored eyes, tail thumping lazily. We searched the area, under logs, behind boulders, up faint game trails, finding nothing but star trunks and our own overlapping prints, no claw marks, or no boot tracks, not even the branch I was certain I'd heard dragging. After an hour, Dad convinced me that nothing else would happen tonight. He told me to get some rest. I reluctantly agreed, but my body refused to comply. The tent felt wrong now, so I unrolled my sleeping bag in the truck bed, locked the canopy, and lay there staring through the window at the towering treetops, trying to push the chill from my bones. The forest, though, never seemed to sleep. Its breath, slow, deep and deliberate, hovered just outside my skin, as though it was watching, waiting. I did not sleep, not really. I hovered, half awake, my heart thumping too loudly, too often. Every creak of the wind, every shift in the branches, made my pulse spike. I waited for the flash of white to appear again, for the face of a stranger, pale and silent, staring through the glass. Dawn came slowly, its grey light bleeding over the eastern ridge. Dad knocked on the truck bed, coffee steaming in one hand, flashlight in the other. I reluctantly climbed out, boots cold on the frozen ground, and we walked the site before breakfast. The morning was crisp, the air thin and sharp. That's when I saw it. The ring of disturbed soil I had imagined around the tents. It was real. A faint groove arced through pine needles and gravel, wide enough for a walking stick. Yet, there was no branch, no log, no explanation for the marks. Beside my flattened tent wall lay two perfect depressions, like someone had knelt there, one knee, then the other. But the prints were too shallow to keep their shape, too perfect to be from a wild animal. Lisa tried to laugh it off, making some comment about coyotes sniffing around tents, but her voice wavered, and her eyes kept darting back to the shadowed timberline, as if she expected something or someone to emerge from behind the trees. Sean poured bourbon into his coffee instead of creamer and whistled for the dog. Daisy ignored him and pressed against Lisa's leg, tail tucked. I rolled my bag back into the truck bed, pretending I just preferred the firmness of the pad. But Dad knew. He only nodded and double-checked the lock on the tailgate. The rest of the day passed in a strange, forced normalcy. We fished below the outlet dam, caught a couple of brook trout, and pretended that the world hadn't shifted on its axis. But even the lake felt wrong, too glassy, too still. On the hike back, I spotted a boot print in the damp soil along the stream, smaller than mine, the heel bisected by a smooth crack. The way older Vibram soles split, I didn't point it out. None of us noticed it. That night, the fire burned longer. The flames chased the dark to the edge of the camp, but still, I heard the forest thinking. Every so often, Daisy would lift her head, ears swiveling, her body tense, but then nothing. No bark, no growl, just a confused whine, as if she smelled something her brain couldn't make sense of. We waited until midnight, then doused the coals together. Dad offered his truck bed again. I accepted. He shut the canopy from the outside with a firm shake and said, "Wake me if anything changes." His voice, though, betrayed him. He didn't expect to rest either. Hours crawled by. Spruce needles clicked against the aluminum shell, a harmless sound, but relentless, a constant reminder that the thin walls separated me from everything beyond. Sometime, maybe 2 in the morning, Daisy yipped twice, sharp and confused. Footsteps followed, Dad's, crunching toward the tree line and back, but he never woke me. When morning opened clear and bright, we decided to leave a day early. No one argued. While Sean collapsed his tent, I coiled the guy lines from mine, shaking out the last of the dust when something white flipped over near the roots of a fir tree. A Polaroid. Its edges were wavering like wet bark. I picked it up carefully, gripping only the corner. The image was dark but distinct. Our 3 tents framed by trees, moonlight catching the silvery rain fly on mine. The camera angle came from inside the woods, yards back. The shot zoomed in with a telephoto lens. A smudge of red digits stamped the bottom, 3:14 a.m. My breath hitched. It was taken when I had been frozen, listening to the zipper rasp. I turned the photo over. Ink had bled in the damp, but the shapes were clear enough. A round smiley face, wide eyes, and beneath it, 3 neat words that looked freshly written. "I see you." For a moment I couldn't hear anything but my own pulse pounding in my ears. Dad's voice finally tunneled through, asking if I found the stake. I slipped the Polaroid into a zip pocket and walked it over to him. Sean and Lisa crowded close. Daisy tucked her tail. We threw our camp into the truck bed without the usual care. The folding of the tent hurried and messy. On the drive down the switchbacks, Lisa kept checking the side mirror. Sean clicked off the safety on the pistol Dad kept between the seats. No one spoke until we reached the ranger station. The ranger studied the photo, logged our coordinates, and promised a patrol would hike in. "Probably a prank," she said, but her knuckles whitened when she handed the picture back, inside a plastic evidence sleeve. Home was hours of asphalt away. I stared out the window, afraid to blink, knowing that the next flash I saw might not be lightning or sun on chrome, but that same cold burst of white. The one that turned my tent into a photograph from inside the dark. I sold that tent days later. The buyer asked why I was giving up a good model so cheap. I told him backcountry nights had lost their magic. He laughed. "The woods are the only place I ever feel safe. I hope he never camps near timberline." Story 5. I never imagined that our anniversary trip would lead us somewhere so terrifying. My husband Jacob and I had always been drawn to forgotten places, abandoned cemeteries, ghost towns, and trails that barely existed anymore. That's exactly why we chose Cherokee, North Carolina for our first wedding anniversary getaway. The idea was to explore the quieter side of the Smokies, away from tourist-packed trails and souvenir shops for a week. Now we'd been comfortably tucked away in our camper near the Okonolu River, adventuring out daily and coming back tired but happy. On our last full day, we planned to visit a place we'd found online called Connor Cemetery. It wasn't on any official maps, and the few scattered references we found online described it as hidden near Couch's Creek, roughly 2 miles from the visitor center. I had scribbled vague directions from half-abandoned message boards into my notebook, excited by the mystery of it all. Jacob laughed at my obsession with documenting everything, but he understood it was part of our shared excitement, the thrill of exploring forgotten places we pulled off. At an unmarked shoulder along Newfound Gap Road, the forest rose darkly around us, thick and heavy with old-growth trees. It felt untouched, forgotten. I led the way, scanning the ground carefully for snakes, holes, anything we might step on. Jacob walked behind, quieter than usual. The forest felt strangely silent as we left the pavement behind. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint, crunching sound of our footsteps. After about minutes, the path became narrower and the woods closed in, branches scraping softly against our shoulders as we passed. The air grew strangely warm, almost stifling, I found, myself glancing back at Jacob more than usual, catching his eyes as he quietly looked around. Something felt different. Here, heavier somehow, he must have felt it too, but neither of us said anything. We had walked a little further when Jacob suddenly stopped behind me. I turned to face him, ready to ask what was wrong when he quietly whispered, "Babe, look at that statue." My gaze instinctively moved toward the direction of his pointing finger, half expecting to see an old weathered angel, the kind you'd see in forgotten cemeteries, but instead what loomed between the distant trees sent a sudden chill down my spine. Standing silently, disturbingly still, was a strange figure, about ft tall, partially concealed by dark trees and thick foliage. At first it looked like a statue, maybe some strange local art, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it didn't resemble anything artistic. Its limbs were thin and unnaturally long, covered in what appeared to be tight, leathery skin, stretched taut over a framework of bones or wood. It had a form vaguely deer-like, but twisted horribly out of proportion. Its face made my skin crawl. The skull looked malformed, blending features of a deer and camel lacking a proper snout. Instead, the mouth hung slightly open, and its eyes were large, glassy, and disturbingly reflective, catching what little sunlight broke through the trees. It didn't move, but there was a terrifying realism to it, as though it might suddenly step forward. "What the hell is that?" Jacob whispered again, voice barely audible, tense with fear. "I don't know." I breathed, unable to look away. Then, ever so subtly, the thing moved its right ear, grotesquely elongated slowly, rotated a full circle, smooth and unnatural, as though listening carefully. In every direction, a faint clicking sound drifted through the silence. As it turned, an almost mechanical noise. My stomach tightened into knots. Jacob took a shaky breath beside me. "It blinked." "Emma," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly with disbelief and dread. "The damn thing blinked." My heartbeat quickened painfully, a sudden wave of nausea hitting me. I hadn't seen the blink, but I didn't doubt Jacob. Nothing about this felt right without needing words. We both took a cautious step backward, then another, never daring to turn our backs completely. The forest remained unnaturally still as we retreated, every rustle beneath our feet amplified in the oppressive silence. I felt as though something watched us. No, something definitely watched us. It felt like eyes boring into the back of my neck, cold and inhuman, following our every step. When our feet finally hit the solid pavement of the road again, sounds seemed to rush back into the world. The distant rush of cars, birdsong, wind, rustling leaves overhead, as if we had exited a bubble, leaving behind something ancient and wrong back at our camper. Jacob didn't say a word for almost an hour, staring blankly at the floor. I felt shaken, unable to process what we just encountered. My hands trembled as I tried, searching for answers online, but there was nothing. No folklore, no reports, no obscure artist claiming responsibility. It was as though the place and whatever we'd seen didn't exist at all that night. Lying awake in the camper, I stared into darkness, terrified of sleep. Jacob tossed, restlessly beside me, murmuring softly under his breath. His dreams clearly troubled. When sleep finally came, I found myself alone on that same narrow trail. It was dark, colder now, the path harder. To follow behind me, just out of sight, I heard the soft clicking sound of something slowly rotating in the darkness, listening, waiting, watching the morning sunlight filtered weakly through the thin curtains of our camper, bathing everything in a strange greyish glow. Neither Jacob nor I had slept much after yesterday's encounter, and the little rest we managed was interrupted by unsettling dreams and the constant sensation of being watched. We sat quietly at the small kitchenette table, sipping lukewarm coffee, neither of us ready to talk about what we'd experienced. Eventually, Jacob broke the heavy silence. "We can't be the only people who've ever seen it," he said quietly, staring into his mug. "Someone local must know something." I nodded, remembering the little Native American bookstore we'd visited earlier in the week, run by an older Cherokee woman named Louise. She'd been friendly, knowledgeable about the region, and had encouraged us to visit lesser-known spots. I hoped she'd have answers, or at least a clue. The drive into town felt longer than before, every turn along the winding roads making me jumpy. Trees pressed close to the road, casting flickering shadows that danced across the windshield, reminding me too much of that twisted figure in the woods. The small bell above the shop door jingled softly as we stepped inside, the air thick with the comforting aroma of old books and incense. Louise greeted us warmly, but the smile quickly faded from her face when she saw our expressions. "What happened?" she asked gently, concern deepening the lines around her eyes. As calmly as we could, Jacob and I described everything: finding the trail, the silence, the disturbing figure, its impossible proportions, its unnatural movements. Louise's expression shifted from curiosity to something more guarded as we spoke, her eyes narrowing. Thoughtfully, she remained silent for several seconds after we'd finished studying us carefully. Then, without a word, she moved to the front door, flipping the open sign to closed, locking the door behind her. "Come with me," she said, her voice quiet and firm. She led us into a back room filled with shelves of older, more fragile books, artifacts, and handmade crafts, sitting us down at a worn wooden table. She took a deep breath, as though considering her words carefully. "You've stumbled onto something that most people here don't talk about openly," she began slowly. "There are old things in these mountains, things that existed long before people arrived. Spirits, watchers, beings whose names were never meant to be spoken aloud." A chill prickled the back of my neck, and Jacob shifted nervously in his chair. "What you saw, it's known but rarely talked about," she continued. "My grandmother warned me about them when I was a child. She called them guardians or watchers, ancient spirits tied to the land. They reveal themselves only when they choose to." "What does it want?" Jacob asked softly, his voice strained. Louise shook her head slightly, her eyes sad but resolute. "It could be a warning. It could be a test. Or it could be hunting." The last word lingered ominously in the air, heavy and inescapable. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do we do now?" Her eyes fixed intensely on mine. "Leave. Forget you saw it, and whatever you do, don't go back. These beings, they're like hooks. The more attention you pay them, the deeper they dig into you." But even as Louise spoke, I felt something inside me resist her advice. A quiet voice whispered that I needed to go back, needed proof, something tangible to ground me in reality. Beside me, Jacob's restless fingers tapped anxiously on the table. I wondered if he felt the same inexplicable draw. We thanked Louise quietly, promising we'd consider her words carefully as we left. She caught my arm gently, looking directly into my eyes. "Emma, Jacob, please. Be careful. Sometimes the more you search, the harder it becomes to escape." Back at the camper, the sun began to set, washing the trees in shades of deep orange and purple. Jacob stared distractedly at nothing, clearly still unsettled by Louise's words. The sense of unease had only deepened rather than faded as darkness settled around us. The oppressive quiet of the night grew heavier. Jacob paced nervously, checking and rechecking the door locks. I found myself staring out the camper window, watching shadows creep slowly through the trees. Something felt very wrong about tonight. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like it was waiting, holding its breath. Then the tapping began at first I thought it was branches brushing against the camper's metal siding, but quickly realized it was two. Rhythmic, two, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, patient sound. Jacob froze mid-step, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered before I could answer. The tapping shifted around the camper, methodically moving from window to window. Whatever it was circled us slowly. As though testing for weaknesses, neither of us dared to move after several minutes. The tapping stopped for a brief moment. Relief flooded through me until Jacob cautiously opened the door flashlight, shaking in his grip, and stepped outside. "Jacob!" I hissed. Following him anxiously, he stopped abruptly, flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the ground outside our camper. Clearly visible in the soft earth were prints, small, deep, hoofed tracks, but they weren't animal tracks, not completely. They looked like they'd been made by something standing upright, like a human with hooves. My breath caught painfully in my throat. Jacob pointed the flashlight upwards, slowly illuminating the side of the camper. There, caught in the window screen, was a tangled clump of coarse grey hair. My chest tightened painfully. "It's been here," Jacob nodded. Silently, face pale, he took my hand firmly, guiding me back into the camper. We locked the door securely, though it suddenly seemed painfully inadequate against whatever lurked outside. We sat, awake. The rest of the night, every noise amplified by our fear at some point. Jacob whispered to me about a dream he'd had, how he'd been walking through the forest behind the creature following. Obediently, feeling strangely calm, almost safe, the sky began to lighten, and as dawn approached, I knew we'd both made our decision. Despite every warning, despite Louisa's plea, we would return to those woods. Something inside us was already pulling us back, hooked deeply, inescapably, and I knew with absolute certainty whatever had found us wasn't done with us yet. I couldn't shake the dread that gripped me as we parked once more by the unmarked pull-off along Newfound Gap Road. The air felt heavier. This morning, oppressive, thick with humidity and something else. Something darker and more sinister. Jacob hesitated beside me, his hand gripping the revolver. Tightly, we had come prepared, carrying bear spray knives, a borrowed gun, and my digital camera. Yet none of it felt reassuring anymore. The trailhead was harder to find this time, as though the forest itself had shifted. Overnight branches now blocking the entrance. More aggressively, leaves brushed coldly against my face as we stepped onto the hidden path. Immediately, that unnatural silence descended again, pressing around us. The comforting noises of birds and wind vanished, replaced by the faint sound of our own breathing. Tense and strained, every step forward felt forced. Jacob's hand trembled slightly as he moved branches aside, clearing the path ahead. After a short distance, he stopped, abruptly pointing to the ground. My stomach dropped as I noticed fresh marks scarring the forest floor. Long drag. Marks as if something large and heavy had recently been pulled through the underbrush. "They moved it." "Jacob," murmured, his voice unsteady. He didn't say who they were, but I understood this. Wasn't random. It felt intentional, deliberate. I raised my camera, snapping. Quick pictures, desperate for some tangible proof. The camera's shutter sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. A mechanical click, click, click that echoed between the trees. After a few photos, I glanced at the screen. My heart stuttered. The images were distorted, corrupted, blurred beyond recognition, like something didn't want to be seen. Few steps further, we came to a clearing ringed by towering, twisted trees. Something immediately felt wrong here. My gaze dropped to the ground, and I froze in horror. Arranged in a perfect circle on the leaf-covered earth were dozens of dead birds, robins, crows, sparrows, all facing inward, wings, neatly folded eyes. Carefully removed, empty sockets staring blankly upwards. No flies buzzed, no ants crawled, as if nature itself refused to touch whatever had happened here. "Oh my God," Jacob breathed. Stepping back, lifted my camera again, forcing myself to document it, but the second I pressed the button, the battery symbol flashed red, and the screen flickered dark. The camera was dead. "Emma," Jacob whispered, urgently gripping my arm painfully. "We need to go now." I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could speak, a soft, sickeningly familiar clicking sound reached my ears. It was slow, rhythmic, the gentle rotation of something terrible behind us. We turned simultaneously, dread flooding me as I recognized the shape hidden just beyond the ring of trees. The creature stood perfectly still, watching. Us with those wide, reflective eyes, sunlight filtered through branches, highlighting its grotesque features clearly, the stretched skin, the two long limbs, that horrific face without a snout. It blinked once, deliberately. Jacob raised the revolver, but his hand shook violently, unable to steady it. His breathing grew erratic, shallow. I grabbed his arm, terrified. "Jacob, snap out of it," I pleaded desperately, but his gaze was locked, unfocused, pupils wide. Transfixed on the creature, his arm dropped limply to his side, the revolver useless in his grip. "Jacob!" I shouted, voice breaking, shaking him roughly. His eyes snapped back into clarity, and he gasped, stumbling backward. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing his wrist and pulling him away from the clearing behind us. The clicking sound grew louder, faster, as the thing began moving closer, weaving silently between the trees. We ran, crashing blindly through thick underbrush. Branches whipped painfully against my face, leaves tangled in my hair. Suddenly my foot caught on a hidden root, and I fell hard, tumbling down a short slope. Pain shot through my ankle, my vision blurring momentarily. I rolled onto my back, heart pounding, eyes darting wildly upward at the ridge above. The creature stood silently, watching it, tilted its head slightly, ear rotating, slowly, deliberately, as if listening to my rapid, panicked breathing. Its empty gaze held mine for what felt like an eternity. It didn't move closer. It merely observed, curious. "Emma!" Jacob shouted from somewhere ahead, panic thick in his voice. I struggled to my feet, adrenaline numbing the throbbing pain, scrambling upwards toward his voice. We burst through the brush onto the paved road, collapsing together, gasping for breath. Faces streaked with dirt and tears, neither of us spoke as we drove frantically away. The forest looming ominously in the rearview mirror. We went straight to the visitor center, desperate to report what we'd seen, but the park ranger behind the counter listened skeptically, gently informing us there was no record of a Connor Cemetery anywhere near Couch's Creek, and no one had reported anything like what we described. He smiled, politely suggesting we might be mistaken. Numb and exhausted, we returned to the bookstore, hoping Louise could help make sense of it, but the shop stood dark and empty, a small fleece sign taped to the inside of the locked window. Louise was gone, and the comforting familiarity of her presence was now just a memory. We drove home in stunned silence, barely sleeping in the days that followed, haunted by nightmares unexplained, tapping sounds, and the constant feeling of being watched. Life settled into a strange new normal, shadowed by what we'd encountered. Nearly a month passed before my phone buzzed suddenly one afternoon, alerting me to a notification from my cloud storage. My chest tightened as I opened it, breathing shallow, hands trembling. One of the corrupted photos from the woods had mysteriously repaired itself. I stared at the image in horror. The circle of birds lay clearly visible, grotesque and unnatural. But worse was the figure in the shadows behind them. The creature stood partially hidden, its horrific face illuminated in perfect clarity, staring directly into the camera. I knew deep down it hadn't let us go. It was only waiting, still watching, still listening, somewhere just beyond sight.